Joining us, New York Times chief White House correspondent and MS Now contributor Peter Baker, MS Now political analyst and former Undersecretary of State in the Obama administration Rick Stengel, and Hofstra University law professor James Sample, who focuses on constitutional law and democracy. Welcome, all of you. Peter, you're up first on this one because Kristen Welker, she kept pushing back to ask Trump on his election fraud claims with evidence. He failed to provide any, and then he stormed off. So the question is, was he likely angry or being challenged with the question, or at not being able to provide evidence?
Well, he has no evidence. So, he can say all he wants, but he's trying to rewrite history about 2020. He's trying to create an alternative version of reality today in order to fit his political needs. He doesn't have any evidence. There's no evidence that there's widespread fraud in the California election. It's true that they are counting slowly, and as they count slowly, different votes are being added up, and therefore it's changing the order of who happens to be ahead at any given time. That doesn't mean it's fraud. That's a function of the way they count the votes. Now, that doesn't matter to him. He doesn't care that the facts aren't there. He was told in 2020 by his own attorney general, by his own campaign staff, by all sorts of people who were around him, including Republican governors and secretary of state, that he had lost. He refused to accept it, and therefore he's created this mythology that's not true, that somehow there was widespread fraud. And he's determined to continue pressing that no matter how many times people tell him it's not true. And Kristen Welker did a great job there of not letting him get away with spreading lies to their viewers.
Yeah, she absolutely did. James, so when you pardon, or you commute a sentence of rioters, and then you push for a fund to pay them for all of that, what does that do to the rule of law in our country? What does it signal to anyone else who may be considering doing the same thing?
It changes the incentive structure. It changes the incentive structure in every single way. If you think about the fundamental premise of criminal justice, it is deterrence. This is the exact diametrical opposite of deterrence. It is rolling out the red carpet. It is the equivalent of stand back and stand by from 2020, right? This is the invitation to do the things that he wants done, and that with the knowledge that you will be forgiven first and rewarded second.
So, James, even if this fund doesn't come back as part of this big, greater IRS settlement, how concerned are you that the president could be exploring other ways to compensate January 6 rioters?
Well, the first thing I'm concerned with, Alex, is that the second half of the so-called settlement. And first, let's just be clear. You can't settle a case that isn't a real case from the jump. And that's why Judge Kathleen Williams is exploring whether or not this is a fraud on the court. Fraud on the court is not just a metaphor. It is a legal term of art. And essentially what she's exploring is whether or not the president and his allies have effectively turned a federal court into a money laundering operation, into a notary that basically legitimizes an otherwise illegitimate gift to themselves. The second half of that has so far been untouched, which is the IRS audit immunity. And from President Trump's perspective and the perspective of his family, that is the real heist. That is worth at least $100 million, according to the New York Times. That is a real thing. So first he's saying that the fund is not going away, even though there's misdirection. And Todd Blanche said last week that it's going away. And then his attorneys said it is not going forward, period. But even there's this subtle semantic shift, right? It's not going forward, period. So at this very instant, it's not moving forward. That doesn't mean it never will.
And it's not being put in writing either, right?
Well, it was put in writing on Friday last week in federal court, where they said that the fund is not going forward. But that doesn't mean it won't ever go forward.
They don't have it in a complete and total, like never, ever, ever.
Right. And the Republicans in Congress last week declined to block this as a matter of legislation, to block it from ever going forward.
So, Rick, I know you joined Peter Baker in complimenting Kristen Welker. She did a wonderful job on that for the way she handled Trump coming after her, the attacks, and what he, wants to be talking about at a very politically challenging moment for him. But to go ahead and change the subject from affordability and an extremely unpopular war, might that be why there were this kind of fireworks?
Well, James used the term misdirection. I mean, he doesn't actually, as you know, answer questions. He has a stream of consciousness of kind of old chestnuts that he says over and over, and he doesn't like to be interrupted. And so he doesn't like to be questioned. So part of his response about the anti-weaponization fund was the 12-year-old boy who can't ever cop to the fact that he lost anything. So it's not, I mean, I think he's reconciled to the fact that it won't exist, but he can never publicly admit to that. He can't publicly admit to any defeat. And just to put it in context, you did a great job explaining it. The origin of it was him extorting his own government for $10 billion. The head of the executive branch suing another part of the executive branch for $10 billion, which is extortion. There is no opposition there. He was hoping to get an actual payout of hundreds of millions of dollars from the IRS. Right. This is his settlement, and the kind of cherry that he got is this agreement that the family won't be prosecuted for any tax fraud, which is the greatest gift, and it's probably unconstitutional.
So, Peter, what are you expecting now, then, from lawmakers who declined at the end of the week to take explicit action banning the fund, apparently taking Blanche at his word?
Well, I mean, one thing we ought to remember is that the people around Trump don't necessarily speak for Trump, right? We saw this on January 6th before. When he came to office for the second term, it was people like J.D. Vance and Mike Johnson and others who said, oh, well, he'll never pardon the violent ones. Maybe he'll pardon the nonviolent ones or some people who went too far but didn't actually beat cops, but he won't actually pardon the cop beaters. And guess what? He did. He pardoned and or gave executive clemency to all 1,600 people who were involved in that attack, including the ones convicted of seditious conspiracy and people who beat police officers. So the people around it can make assurances all they want. They can even put lines in a court document, as we just discussed. But that doesn't mean that Trump's going to give up. It doesn't mean that he might not find some other way of doing it. Now, the question is whether Republicans are going to accept this and say, well, we can move on. It's done. Don't listen to him. He's not going to go forward, and hope that he doesn't between now and November. But if he does between now and November try to find some other way of doing it, it puts them back on the hook. And they know this is not popular with their constituents. It's such an easy attack line for Democrats that they want to make sure he doesn't do that. And I imagine that there have to be Republicans telling him right now that whatever you told Kristen Welker, please don't bring this back because it's suicide for the party.
James, Blanche himself, he faces confirmation hearings coming up, right? He's got senators on both sides of the aisle disapproving, and they're the ones to whom he's going to have to appeal when he answers their questions. So how does he go about squaring this with the president's remarks to get the job that he so clearly wants?
He so clearly craves. I mean, it's at a level of obsession that borders on, Captain Ahab chasing Moby Dick. Todd Blanche wants this job as badly as anyone has ever wanted a job. But think about what he has to overcome to get it, at least to get official confirmation. He may be able to continue as acting attorney general merely if the president submits the nomination and then they run out the clock because his acting date of expiration resets once the president formally submits the nomination. But think about it. The person who's aiming to be the attorney general says that the administration is, quote, at war with judges. The person aiming to be attorney general is the one that the prior attorney general essentially tagged with the Epstein matter and all of the mishandling of the Epstein matter. And in terms of the anti-weaponization fund, think about the journey that Todd Blanche has gone on just in the last several weeks alone. He was reported to be one of the voices who was opposed to the fund. Then he was the one who had to go to Capitol Hill and testify in support of the fund before he then opposed the fund yet again. So this is a cross that he is going to have to bear.
What hope, Rick, does he have for continuing this audition with the president auditioning but having to answer questions in front of the Senate as he goes for this role?
Well, far be it from me to advise Mr. Blanche, but he doesn't really have to audition anymore. The president said that he's nominating him. If I were him and I wanted to be confirmed, I would move to a more moderate area rather than echoing the president's anti-constitutional speech. But it's going to be
Supreme Court judges have done, by the way.
Yes.
in their confirmation hearings.
Yeah, but he has multiple audiences. He has the president's audience, he has Congress, and he has the public. And so he is kind of caught between all of them and can't actually come up with a kind of coherent line, I don't think.
So, Peter, what about Trump's immunity from the IRS tax audits? Certainly, James has touched on that here. What avenues are left to check the president for that piece of the deal, which has remained very much alive, even as Blanche has claimed, yeah, the fund is dead, but doesn't really talk about that?
Yeah, it's striking how much the Republicans in the Senate went, ballistic over the $1.8 billion fund and made no mention of any concern, at least it seems like, over the IRS immunity. It's a get out of audits free card in which the president now and his family and business can say, well, anything we did in the past, we get away with. We don't have to pay back taxes. We don't have to pay interest. We don't have to pay penalties. That's a nice deal for anybody that's out there looking for that kind of thing. And as James pointed out, my colleagues at the Times a few years ago estimated that on one audit alone that we knew of, if he were found, to be out of compliance, that would have cost him $100 million then. You add the interest since then, it's no doubt much, much more than that right now. So it's not a theoretical thing. It's a very tangible thing. And remember, this is a president whose own organization, whose own business, the Trump Organization, wholly owned business by the president and his family, was convicted in criminal court of tax evasion. So again, this is not a theoretical thing. This is a president and a family that has done everything it could to get out of paying taxes and complying with tax law, according to the court and according to some of these tax experts who have examined these things. So the Republicans in the Senate seem not to have focused on that, but I imagine that will come up in conversation as the campaign gets going.